Good morning and welcome to Quick Take Charge. I'm Madison Mills in for Jen Zabasaja. We're going to dig into sports betting's 2022 outlook in just a few minutes, but we got to start, of course, with December's jobs report, which came out just a few minutes ago. U.S. employers added fewer jobs in December than forecast. Payrolls increased by 199,000 in December, a big miss from the estimated 450,000. Meanwhile, the unemployment rate declined to 3.9%. That's a fresh pandemic low and just above the 3.5% rate prior to the COVID-19 hit. The labor force participation rate was also unchanged. All of this adding to evidence of a challenging hiring environment that's making it tough to meet demand amid the persistence of this pandemic. Let's get into what all of this means with congressional reporter Emily Wilkins. And we're also joined by senior economic analyst at Bankrate, Mark Hamrick. Thank you both so much for joining us. Mark, I want to kick things off with you. Just tell me what your interpretation is of these numbers as we're getting them in this morning.
Well, it feels like take the pandemic and add a little Groundhog Day, and we have the second month in a row here where there's a stark contrast between the household and establishment surveys. And yet we know from the evidence we gather elsewhere, including the ADP report, that the job market is tight. And so I tend to want to go with, something along the lines of the unemployment rate falling to 3.9% as being the more accurate picture. And I feel like perhaps the establishment survey is having a difficult time capturing the real story on the ground. It may be the part of the problem is that there are more home-based businesses starting up, which would not be well captured by this. But I think at the end of the proverbial day, we're going to believe that the job market remains tight, that employers are continuing to have a hard time finding the workers they need and want. And we're going to obviously need to get into the report a month from now to see what the lingering impacts and perhaps the widening impacts of the Omicron variant will be in that report.
Well, kicking off then with you, Emily, as Mark mentions, the persistence of the Omicron variant continuing into 2022, we can kind of expect to see similar reports in the coming months. To what extent is that going to impact the political situation, especially as we're in the midterms this year?
So one way this might wind up impacting things is that if lawmakers on Capitol Hill feel like there's really doing a hard hit to businesses, to restaurants, that they are going to need some help because of Omicron, they might wind up passing additional supplemental funding. We heard reports this week that a couple lawmakers, Democrats and Republicans, are actually coming together and starting to look at a much smaller stimulus package than from some of the other ones that we've seen, but something that would just give a little bit of a boost to companies that are still really struggling right now. Of course, the question is, how does that fit into all the other things that Congress has on their plate right now? But remember, Congress actually has to pass a bill to fund the government by mid-February. So this could be something where they wind up allocating some funding, having some supplemental funding directed at businesses if they feel like they are very much struggling to bounce back due to the Omicron variant.
Mark, how necessary do you think more stimulus is heading into 2022? We might be having trouble hearing Mark, so I'm going to head over to Emily. Emily, it looks like the number of people whose layoffs are characterized as permanent continues to really plummet here. Again, with the politics side of this, do you picture Biden really pushing forward that message as a way of kind of dealing with the approval ratings he's been getting so far with regards to his handling of the economy?
Well, Biden, of course, is going to take this report, is going to highlight the things he wants to and really sort of paint it in a picture that winds up being good for his administration priorities. We're going to be hearing from the president coming up here at the end of the 10 o'clock hour. One thing that Biden might wind up pointing to is that unemployment rate, that 3.9%, showing that, that is sort of the best at this point during the pandemic. We're getting back to where we were pre-pandemic. Biden could potentially deliver that message today, but he could also also use this job report to say, look, more assistance is needed. He can point back to his currently stalled social spending and tax plan, point to the number of jobs that White House economists have said that will create, and use this jobs report as a way for arguing that additional stimulus and policy is needed to really help the U.S. get out of this pandemic and get on the right foot. This could also further President Biden's push to ensure that more people are vaccinated. That's certainly the big topic today in Washington as the Supreme Court begins debates over two of President Biden's vaccine mandates that could wind up impacting tens of millions of people if they were to be enacted.
Right, SCOTUS is taking on Biden's vaccine mandate today. If held up, what would that mean for, like you said, retailers, restaurants? What is the economic implication there?
Well, at this point, it's been interesting to sort of play the whole game of why people aren't coming back to the job market. Initially, there was the idea that they were getting that extra $300 in unemployment, but then that ended. The jobs numbers still have had some really rough months. There was the idea that kids need to be back in schools. Now, of course, you can argue a lot of schools are open, but they're going back to virtual schooling on and off with Omicron. There's really a big question mark whether the pandemic has just changed how some people see their jobs and what they want to do with their lives. So I think at this point, we're still trying to figure out the puzzle of why employment doesn't look better at these month-to-month rates, and really how not just the economy, but also policymakers need to respond to those changes.
I love that you bring up kind of just the changing definition of employment, and we've seen that throughout the pandemic. I feel like every day in my news feeds, I see another influencer saying that they quit their full-time job to go into social media marketing. Mark, going back to you here, a lot of economists have used this term full employment as a really key metric here. Can you explain what that means and why that's such an important metric for us to continue to monitor?
Well, I think first of all, we think about the Federal Reserve's mandate of maximum employment, which is essentially synonymous with that idea. And the Fed obviously had previously prioritized that. Perhaps that in the lens of the rearview mirror in history might be viewed as a mistake, since inflation has been the big surprise of the last year and beyond. But, the Fed is going to try to attack both of these issues. And that's why I think that when we look at an unemployment rate of 3.9%, perhaps essentially getting back to 3.5% or lower this year, if employers can find the workers they need, inflation is going to continue to be the story. And so there's going to be this balancing act between.
Oh, we're still having a little bit of trouble with Mark, but I think he brings up a really interesting point that the Fed can use these numbers as potentially a green light for March interest rate hikes. Going back to you here, Emily, Democratic U.S. Senator Ben Cardin is again exploring another round of stimulus funding. But given what we talked about with Olivia Rockman earlier this week, that quit rates are higher than ever, do we anticipate people just continuing to quit their jobs, the continuing of the Great Resignation heading into 2022? And how will that impact the jobs reports in the months ahead?
You know, this is such a unique situation that we're in right now with this pandemic, looking at job numbers, looking at people are behaving. My crystal ball's in the shop. I can't tell you if we're going to be seeing more people continuing to quit their jobs as part of this Great Resignation. I think one thing lawmakers are going to really have to be cognizant of is if people are quitting their jobs, what jobs are they going into? Are contractors becoming a bigger industry? Are you seeing more people, say, become Uber drivers or begin their own businesses? And what kind of impacts is that going to have on the policy landscape? I remember back when sort of the very first COVID stimulus was distributed, there was a moment where a lot of those independent contractors said, hey, wait a sec, we're not getting any of that stimulus, and we should be able to because our jobs have been impacted too. Lawmakers had to kind of go back, correct that. So this might wind up sort of seeing larger policy changes in how Congress and other governments view the labor landscape.
Emily, final question to you. What is the one thing Biden has not been doing that he needs to get voters on his side with his handling of the economy as he preps for a 2024 rerun? Does he need to get Build Back Better through? Does he need to convince people that he's got inflation handled? What's the biggest thing he's got to do here?
I mean, yes, yes, and yes. I mean, really at this point, we say this so much with elections, but it really does boil down to the kitchen table issues. It's the things that people are thinking about every day, the ways that they are being the most impacted. Certainly inflation is a huge concern for the Biden administration. They know that's an issue. That's something Biden's really ramped up his messaging on, trying to address issues with the supply chain, trying to address shortages that are occurring across the nation. I think a lot of what Biden's success is going to look at depends on the economy, and a lot of what the economy's success is going to depends upon how this pandemic goes. And if there's a variant after Omicron, what does that look like? And when do we get more Americans to vaccinated so we can start going back to normal?
And I have a feeling we're going to continue these conversations a lot over the course of the next year, Emily. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. That was Emily Wilkins joining us from the Capitol, and Mark Hamrick as well. Thank you both so much for being here.